and hopefully it should be fairly straightforward this morning. First off then, apologies for absence, and we can record Betty's apologies. Any declarations of interest in relation to this morning's agenda items? No, thank you. In that case then, can we move on to item 3, which is the report on from accountancy and the report on the revenue budget monitoring outturn. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you. The report this morning monitors the revenue budget income and expenditure against budget for the period to 31st of October, it seems a long time ago now, on the basis of the information and taking account of the forecast council tax collection. A year-end operational underspend of 679,000, or 0.2% of the annual budget, is forecast on general fund services. And as usual, the reasons for the departmental variances are all set out in the report narrative. Any such operational underspend at the end of this year would obviously be helpful to the council in meeting future budget challenges. And it's worth saying that the above figures reflect that 2.645 million of forecast COVID pressures have been incurred but are covered by drawing on the council's COVID grant resources, so they don't impact in the operational budget position that I've mentioned. Yeah. The figures in the report that we're looking at just now were prepared, in advance of Christmas, and they haven't yet been adjusted to reflect the impact to local government employees' pay award for 21-22, which was only recently settled. And neither do they include the 21-22 government grant redeterminations that were only confirmed to us just before the Christmas break. These factors will be taken into account in the next monitoring report, but having looked at them, we are expecting that they would, all things being equal and nothing else changing, produce an increased underspend. So things are heading in the right direction there. As I always say, the forecast outturn position could still be subject to significant change. For example, if there was a great upsurge in COVID pressures again, or as the current teachers' pay award for 21-22 still isn't settled and could yet come in at higher level than anticipated. So we're asking Cabinet to approve the budget adjustments that are shown in the report, note the current financial position, and in view of the very challenging financial outlook that's emerging for 22-23 and beyond, we're asking that directors take immediate action to avoid, as we've done before, all non-essential spend for the remainder of this financial year. We did that in 2021, and we're asking that we resume that again just now.
Okay, thanks very much, Margaret, again for a comprehensive report, and albeit the figures don't take into account everything over the last few weeks and prior to Christmas, but hopefully that there will be some stability in that figure as we move forward. I think it's right that we continue, given the challenging outlook that we know is coming to bear, that we continue to look at any non-essential expenditure and, if at all possible, hold back on that in order to give us a more reasonable figure for moving into the next year. Anyone else get any further comments on the paper?
Sorry.
Danny, when you go.
Just a question in regards to the... You okay? Okay to speak?
Yeah, when you go, yeah.
Sorry, I thought somebody else was speaking there. Just the funding we got for COVID pressures, have we used it all, or is there much left?
We haven't used it all. We will be carrying some forward into 22-23, and our budget for 22-23 takes account of that. So we're using the carry forward some to soak up COVID pressures for next year that are not been covered in the grant figure for next year.
Right. Much is it, Margaret? Much is left?
We're changing that all the time, but I can tell you we're using about 5.7 million of carry forward money next year to soak up anticipated COVID pressures.
Right, I'm talking about the funding we got from the Scottish Government. Much is left in that pot.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We're still chipping away and drawing more down this year, but I would say certainly at the moment there'll be in excess of 6 million left, but much of that is already committed for next financial year.
So much is not committed.
I'll come back to you out with the meeting and give you an exact figure of that once I've got the most up-to-date forecast.
I think it's also an unknown aspect.
We don't know what we're going to have to face in terms of pressures, both in the remainder of this year and in next year.
Yeah, because
hopefully the pandemic's finished. We're getting to the end of it. So I'm just wondering if the money that's left can be absorbed in their own budget.
I would think I think it's much too early to take a view on that.
Yeah, and obviously, Danny, what we don't know yet is, as much as there appears to be a bit of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the pandemic, we're still looking at the issues that it has left behind. So there will still be issues, whether it be in long COVID, whether it be in care issues, etc., that may well still be having an impact for some time yet. So we need to
understand that.
Yeah,
I'm just hopeful that money can be absorbed into the general fund.
Okay, anyone else get any comments? No, are we happy then with the recommendations in the paper, in particular noting the current underspend of 679,000 and in view of the challenging financial outlook for 2023 and beyond, the directors continue to avoid all non-essential expenditure for the remainder of the year. I'll be happy to know all of the recommendations in the paper. Thank you, everyone. Moving on then, next item on the agenda, item 4, and it's, I lost my agenda. Director of Environment's report on carbon emissions reporting for 2019-20 and 2020-21. And Andy, you covering that?
Right, thanks very much. I'll do my best here. I've just been texted and phoned incessantly by Phil, who was meant to be presenting these 2 reports this morning, to say that his PC's crashed. he can't get on. But thankfully, in terms of the carbon emissions reporting, it's really just for information. We commissioned to start this process, and given the recent decision by the council to support the particular motion, we've started to get baseline information for our carbon so that we know what we have to reduce and by when. So essentially the report's really just for information and starting to flag up some of the key issues. If I can take you down to paragraph 7, it kind of explains the methodology and the scope of the emissions that were covered. So I won't go into them in any great detail, but there are 3 types of scope. And they're all explained in paragraph 7. And we've tried to do some benchmarking with other local authorities, but the way the guidance is framed, different local authorities have different ways of calculating things. But anyway, it's to give us an idea of the scope, the magnitude of the problem. Surprisingly, if you go to paragraph 14, it found that everybody expected that the biggest carbon pollution would come from things like our buildings, our fleet in particular, bin lorries, all that type of stuff. But it's not accurate. If you look at paragraph 14, you'll see that the biggest element is 57% of the carbon emissions are due to procurement or supply chain emissions. So we're starting to look at that. That's about embedded. I don't want to get into technical phrases and all that, but it's about embedded carbon in the products that you buy. So you have to take all that into account. The implications. Phil, is that you back in now?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about that. Couldn't have happened at a worse time.
It's just typical, isn't it? Right. So you carry on. I was just saying, really, I don't know at what point you joined this, but this report's really just for information, and it just highlights the outcome of our initial carbon baseline and sets out the magnitude of the problem facing us. And I'd got as far as explaining that surprisingly we found that the highest carbon polluter, so to speak, is the supply chain in relation to procurement at 57%. So I'll hand it back over to you now, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll
Sorry
take
about
over.
this, folks.
Apologies if I repeat anything that Andy has said. So this paper is sharing the results of the recent carbon baseline exercise, and I've just got half a dozen points I wish to note. Firstly, we are suggesting that our baseline is the year 2019-20, which is the last year of pre-COVID council operations, and that be used as the baseline year against which all progress towards net zero will be measured. There's obviously a statutory requirement on the Scottish Government to achieve net zero by 2045. We've committed to play our part as a council, both through our own climate emergency declaration, the Get to Zero ambition statement, and the preparation of the Get to Zero action plan. This carbon baseline only measures carbon emissions from the council's own operations and doesn't include the carbon emissions that are emitted by our council residents. Paragraphs 7 and 8 detail what specific emission sources have been included in the baseline. And as Andy was noting, those top sources include procurement, gas and electricity supply to council buildings, waste management and fuel. And the appendix to the report contains a full breakdown of those emission sources. In particular, paragraph 8 provides more detail on what are called scope 3 or indirect emissions. And scope 3 emissions are those that are made up from our supply chain. So if we purchase something and what we purchase has a carbon content, that's noted as a scope 3 emission. Now, we are currently not required to include scope 3 emissions in our reporting to the Scottish Government. However, it is deemed to be best practice, and we have chosen to include them as it is anticipated that there will be a requirement to include scope 3 emissions for public bodies in the future. Paragraph 6 details the baseline measurement, which is 70,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2019-20. I think that is the equivalent to all of the council's 95,000 residents taking a round the world flight. And I draw that comparison in order to demonstrate the scale of the challenge that we face as a council in trying to reduce our emissions. It's my intention to bring forward a paper shortly on a framework for what I would call a carbon climate change impact assessment. And that will ensure that the carbon impacts of all the key council decisions are understood, and we can look at how they will contribute and detract from our Get to Zero ambition. And finally, in order to fulfill our statutory reporting requirements and to measure our progress in relation to Get to Zero, this will be an annual recurring exercise and a report which will be presented to Cabinet each year. And on that basis, I'm happy to recommend this report to Cabinet, and obviously we'll take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil. Much appreciated. It is a comprehensive report. And I think you're right. I think we should use the figures for 1920, given that was the last full year, because we know that there has been an impact with COVID or the pandemic in terms of a reduction in our carbon output, but that's maybe gives us a false figure and simply highlights some of the areas that we may need to work on. I think it's right. I mean, it was surprising to find that procurement and our supply chain was such a significant factor in what we do, although I suppose when you actually think about it, you start to put the pieces together and understand that because of the long chain that's involved in much of that. But equally, I think, yeah, it was quite a surprising figure in terms of the amount and the largest percentage in by some way, realistically, in terms of the report. I think it's also right to include the scope 3 issues because it will come, and at the end of the day it's carbon emissions, and we're going to look at how we tackle that and how and the challenge that is in front of us in front of us, as you highlighted, is significant. So I think it should be included. Councillor Bamford.
Thanks, Chair. And like you, I agree. Just the baseline is 2019-20, because I think we all saw the pictures worldwide of China and pollution and smog and other countries throughout the world, and we saw how much emissions. So that would be it's only right that we go back to 2019-20. And like everyone is surprised by the scope 3, about the 57% of our emissions coming indirectly from procurement. It's mentioned about speaking, you know, looking at our procurement and looking at the people we buy our services from. How much influence realistically would we have on them to reduce their emissions? I'm not sure whether will they be like local authorities. Will all these other organisations eventually have to produce reports for government to see what they're doing to reduce? I presume they will be. I don't know if statutorily they have to get. So what would we do if we are finding it difficult to influence them? Will we be looking at when we're doing procurement? Will there be a question in part of the procurement process about their emissions and what they're doing to reduce them? Will we look at that when we're deciding on services and contracts? And the other question I want to ask is that the member officer community group liaison that we talked about after as part of our motion that Councillor Ireland and I brought, we mentioned this group and how we need to have not just the council, we need the residents, we need local businesses and communities on board. When is that going to begin? Now, I believe there was something brought to audit and scrutiny to say it would be after the election, which I totally get, but is it possible that those meetings could start without councillors so that officers, community groups, people like that can meet and get the ball rolling? Because if we're talking about after an election, we're realistically talking after summer. So we're talking August, September, that's 7 months down the line. And I don't think we have time to waste. So my two questions are about what we will do in terms of the scope 3, about suppliers and services, and this new group, when can we realistically start?
Did you wish me to come back, Councillor?
Yeah, if you want to come back
Yes.
in.
Yeah, absolutely. In relation to the legislation for private companies, there's no requirement yet for them to report their emissions, but I suspect such legislation is in the pipeline. How we deal with our suppliers, this obviously isn't just an issue which faces us as a local authority, it will face all of the 32 local authorities in Scotland. So I would expect national action to be taken by the local authorities to liaise with all of our suppliers and to address that issue. So it is something that is being looked at, and it's something that is being looked at on a national basis. In relation to the member office of public working group that you mentioned, as you said, it was raised at the audit and scrutiny committee last week, and I committed to speak to my staff and look at bringing that forward. So I'm currently looking at proposals as to how we could bring that forward so it didn't need to wait until after the elections.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Councillor Merrick.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks, Andy and Phil, for the report. It is extremely comprehensive, which is wonderful, but I can only pick out a couple of points. I was also surprised at the procurement percentage, 57%, a massive number. So if we can get that down, but how are we actually going to get that down? By buying stuff off other people who've got a better footprint, or what? How do we set about that, or do we do it through COSLA, join up with all the other local authorities and freeze out the carbon polluters, or what? Yeah, that's one question, Phil.
Okay, I think what we need to do.
It's a big question.
Okay, yeah. I think when people say the report is extremely comprehensive, that sometimes means it's very, very long and not the most exciting of reports, which I do appreciate. I think what we need to do in relation to our procurement emissions is break them down into their component parts. So for some things, we need to buy less. For other things, we need to buy differently. And I think they're probably the two key actions. Are we currently buying things or spending our money on things that we perhaps don't need to spend? And that could be, for example, reducing our consumption of electricity, which could reduce our emissions. And then secondly, is there a product on the market available which has a lower carbon content? So we all are aware, for example, of in the past we would purchase paper, now we buy paper that is recycled. What we need to do is to identify what products there are on the market which have less of a carbon content, which in turn will reduce our Scope 3 emissions. The market is somewhat unsophisticated at the moment, so some of the products we need to purchase are not necessarily available at the moment, but we do anticipate there'll be a lot of research and development and innovation in that area between now and 2030. But as I say, what we need to do is we need to analyse our procurement emissions, look at what we need to buy less of, look at what we need to buy differently, and basically approach it on a component by component basis.
Okay, so just to go back on that, then the worry there is that they become more expensive to do, and this is what Caroline touched on. I think hopefully the people that we buy for will also be given targets, compelled in some way, or encouraged strongly to help address this problem. Because people will definitely think it's a good idea to cut carbon emissions, but they don't want to pay for it. And they don't want to get cold, and they want to keep their cars. They want to keep petrol cars because the electric ones don't go far enough. They do go far enough, but people think they want to drive more than a couple of 100 miles a week in and around East Rand, and maybe they don't, but they're expensive, and you can't charge them. There's a whole lot of stuff here. We'll bring this to our next chat.
Yeah. If by way of example, if we build a house, there's a carbon content in that house with the bricks, with the steel. So there are Scope 3 emissions with the construction of that property. Yesterday, I went to see a house that had been constructed, which is carbon neutral. There are no Scope 3 emissions in that house because it's built from a range of materials, largely wood, which is sustainable wood. It's Scottish wood, so there aren't the transportation emissions that are linked with that. So it is possible to buy some products that are carbon neutral. Not all of those products are more expensive, although some of those products will be. So as I say, it's about breaking down our spend into its component parts and looking at what's available on the market. But there are some things out there at the moment that we can be exploring.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Councillor Lafferty.
Thank you, Tony. Just like Phil, I'm afraid I had some problems with my computer which weren't resolved until after the weekend. So I'm a wee bit not totally au fait at this stage, but it does appear to be an interesting report. But on Tuesday, I had a representation from a constituent concerned about the number of charging points available in East Renfrewshire, and if we could give her some reassurance on what our plans are to expand that if we're able. Okay, Tony.
Very, very valid point, Alan. I was about to bring up the same point myself, because I know that we've all had issues. Yes, we have charging points, but unfortunately, I think the majority of them have been out of service for some months, and I know that it's an ongoing problem, given that they're supposed to be maintained by a private company who are effectively failing to do so. But it was one of the things I was going to suggest as an aspect that we do need to look at, because I know that there are significant problems with our charging infrastructure, and that, as much as the cost of electric vehicles is having an impact across our authority, no doubt putting people off. But yeah, I think you're right, Alan. Phil?
Yeah, just to say by way of background, as you say, Councillor Buchanan, we do, or we did, I'd need to check it's still the case, have some issues with the company that were meant to maintain the charging points. But there is a national conversation taking place as to where the responsibility for the installation of charging points should lie. Initially, local authorities were given capital grant funding to install them, but obviously as the amount of charging points we need increases, there is a conversation taking place, is a local authority the best placed body to provide charging points? If we think about a petrol car, local authorities don't provide petrol stations. Local authorities don't provide the means by which an individual will fuel their vehicle. And I think there is an expectation nationally that the burden for the supply and provision of charging points will move from the public sector to the private sector, in part because of the cost burden that is imposed upon the public sector and the cost of running them. And as I understand it, Transport Scotland and the Scottish Futures Trust see the sustainable future for electric vehicle charging points as being provided by the private sector. But these conversations, these policy conversations and these funding conversations are currently ongoing on a national basis.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Phil. I appreciate that. And the concern is, my understanding is the units that we currently have are still not viable and that they haven't been repaired. And I know, as far as I'm aware anyway, we've been in touch with the company and trying to put pressure on them to fix them, but I know it has been some months. Colin, were you wanting back in? No, just your hands up. Okay. On that basis, then, colleagues, you'll be happy with the recommendations in the report and that we continue on the basis discussed and continue to take forward our route to net zero. Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 5 on our agenda, and again, the report on the Community Empowerment Scotland Act and Community Asset Transfer. And Phil, you again.
Okay, thank you, Tony. The purpose of this report is to update the Council's community asset transfer policy to ensure the Council can deliver its legislative obligations under the Community Empowerment Act. One of the things that the Act introduces, and this is probably the headline element of the Act, is a right for community bodies to make requests to local authorities for any land or buildings that the community body feels that they could make a better use of. And that could be either for them to own it or to lease it. Normally, one is talking about properties that are currently empty, but that is not always the case. And the purpose of this policy is the purpose of this report is to provide a transparent policy and process for applicant organisations. It provides an updated framework for managing and assessing applications. It provides detail on how we will assess the assets that are being requested. It sets out the framework and criteria under which the applications would be dealt with, and also sets out an appeals process and the governance in terms of the Council's procedures. These criteria and policies apply whether the property is sought by means of an outright sale of an asset or release. The Community Empowerment Act is silent on the monetary value the Council should accept for the transfer of an asset. So what we did is we looked at the approach taken by other local authorities in Scotland, and we are proposing a maximum discount of up to 25% of the market value would be accepted for transfer via an outright sale, subject to any legal tests or restrictions on disposals that would be required by the law. For lease premises, we are proposing the same percentage discount, i.e. 25%, but for a lease premise, further discounts could be agreed on a case-by-case basis, which would be dependent upon the community benefits, which would be derived by the organisation that was leasing the premises. That is a brief summary of the paper, and I'm obviously happy to take any questions that members may have on the paper.
Thanks very much. Oh yeah, I think this is a long-awaited paper. I think a very welcome paper, given some of the discussions that we've had in recent times. So yeah, I very much welcome this paper because I think it does bring clarity to the process and enables our community groups to be able to look at it, have the discussions with us and look at what their needs may be and how we can best serve our communities with any properties that either we are not using or that could be better utilised in terms of the community. So a very welcome paper, and I think all of the very valid points in that. Happy to bring in Councillor Merrick. You're on mute, Colin.
There you go. Right. Did I just bring my hand down or not? Yeah, I brought my hand down but didn't go mute. Fantastic. Right, we'll get there yet. We'll blame the laptop if it was my own. Okay. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Tommy. Thanks, Phil, for the report. It's a good report and the policy is good. Yeah. I wanted to ask one point about provision for other stakeholders who may be using some of our buildings, and I'm thinking now perhaps about, you know, the Leisure Trust, who don't have any buildings of their own, but maybe using some of our buildings that we might wish to allow the community to access or to buy even or whatever. Have we got room for consulting all other stakeholders or a review group of other stakeholders whenever a buy comes up?
Yes, I think we have. I think we have adequate provision to ensure that sufficient consultation of stakeholders takes place.
Yeah, it's just that we have the arm's length thing, obviously with the trust, but I know that some buildings they may have used for, maybe things were stored there for a long time and so on. So we just need to make sure that, and not just them, all other stakeholders who might have an interest in a sale. That was just to make that point. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks, Bob. Yeah, it's just making sure that we consult properly in any building that is currently being used. If it's on the agenda for a transfer, that we make sure that the current usage is looked at and what the implications are.
Yeah. Thanks.
Councillor Bamford.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, and I agree with what Colin told me. Tony said it's great to have a real, very detailed, but not too long, Phil. It's all right, it's not too long. A very detailed report, comprehensive, explaining, you know, what the rules are. I'm just a bit, maybe I haven't read it all thoroughly enough, but the questions I want to ask is what, you know how we've done it for the wet, and we've done it for a couple of places when we've given a long, I think it was 125-year lease and let them buy it. There was conditions on that to ensure that they didn't resell it. So I did think I saw something in it, but I can't find it again, about if we give it as a community transfer, is there any clauses preventing groups from selling it on and realising the asset? And the second question is around the 25% of the value for sale or for lease. Some of our buildings, as we know, have lain for a while and some are not in optimum condition. Is that 25% value, who determines that? Is that the valuation place in Renfrewshire? And do they value it based on its current condition, or do they base it on the market value? Well, I know it's the market value, but on the basis that the council would bring it up to standard before they sell or lease something, or is it as seen? I'm just wondering how they calculate how much a building is worth either for lease or for sale.
Okay. In relation to your first point, I'll need to come back to you on some of the detail in terms of terms and conditions of a future on sale. In relation to the second point, it would be the value of the building as it currently is. So if a building could cost £100,000 but had been empty for a number of years, was in a state of disrepair and was currently valued at £30,000, £30,000 would be the value of the property, because that's what it is at the moment. So does that answer the question?
Yep. So that the cost of bringing something up to standard would fall on the new owner or leaseholder then?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, can I ask one more question? So what if you have several parties interested in a property or a building or an area? How do you decide? Do you look at bids? Do you look at who puts the best business case? How do you make a decision if there is more than one one community group or one organisation interested in an area?
We would look at well, there would be a range of factors we would take into account: the proposed purpose or use of the building, the frequency of use of the building, the community benefit that would be achieved by the wider area, maybe whether the organisation is properly constituted, whether the organisation has the financial capacity to deliver on their promises or what they say will deliver. So there would be a number of factors that would be taken into account. And one of the reasons that we have a fairly wide-ranging and comprehensive assessment body is to ensure we have a sufficient range and depth of skills from the assessment panel to able to pose and answer all of those questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. Do we have any other questions? No. In that case then, colleagues, I say a very welcome report. I'll be happy then with the recommendations to approve the amended community asset transfer policy, approve the establishment of the CAT working group and CAT leadership group, support the relevant departments to notify the asset transfer lead with the named representatives outlined in the paragraphs 14 within 2 weeks of approval. Note the upgrading to the ERC CAT webpage and literature to help communities understand the procedures required to request a transfer, and remit the consideration of the CAT review panel and its terms of reference and membership to the Council. I'll be happy to approve those recommendations, colleague. Thank you, and much appreciated. Thanks, folks, for the work done in the presentation of today's reports. That's all much appreciated. I think that concludes our business for this morning. So thank you once again and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.